فمحمد رح يمرق ورقة اللي بده يكتب اسمه مشان يعرف شو عم بيصير بدايرة الأدب العربي واللغة العربية، في يكتب اسمه هنيك مع الإيميل. I will do the English. Don't speak English. I would like to welcome you all to this lecture on the Madahib of Modernity by Ziad Dallal. I met Ziad the first time in November, I think, in Mesa, and he was presenting on Shadia. And sorry, there is no microphone, so you have to tune up your ears. So I met Ziad in November, and he was working on Shadia. So I'm very happy that when Bilal asked me to introduce him here, because any friend of Shadia is a friend of mine. Ziad is doing his PhD at NYU in comparative literature. His dissertation traces the literary politics of 19th century Egypt and the Levant through a comparative philology. His research areas include, but are not limited to, Arabic intellectual history, Arabic literature, theater and film, philosophy, Marxism, and finance. Join me in welcoming Ziad to this event, to this lecture.
Thank you. I'm humbled by this presence. I'm going to be shouting a bit. Nothing against you. I just don't have a microphone. I'm humbled to be in the presence of my mentors and friends and people that I don't know, strangers. And I'm humbled to be presenting here in the place where I first started. Not particularly this project, but my academic career. And I also have to say, and AUB has a new slogan, Boldly AUB, and I don't think it would be bold of anyone to propagate messages on this campus regarding electroshock therapy and homosexuality in 2 days' time. So I think that if we want to be bold, we have to defend the rights of queer, transgender, and homosexual people on this campus especially. I'm going to be talking today about Shidyak, Ahmed Faris Shidyak, a 19th century intellectual from Lebanon, and what he means by madhab. So let's start. If my voice ever dims down, please let me know and I'll remember to raise it again. Okay? Okay. In the 418th issue of Al-Jawa'id, the Traveling News, a journal published from Istanbul between 1860 and 1884, Ahmed Faris al-Shidyak, the journal editor, writes, quote, "It is a custom of journal writers in Europe to adhere to a known school of politics, so that it becomes a slogan they are known by. Some think the republic is better than a monarchy, and others that an empire is better than both. Each of these schools has its own parties, adherents, creations, and innovations. Some of its writers are artists or scientists, others are advisors and ministers, and others are merchants and accountants. For those who ask about the school of Al-Jawa'id and its owner, and which opinion is the best of all these newspapers, the answer is that Al-Jawa'id is of all of these schools, and not only of one." End quote. This editorial by Al-Shidyak exemplifies the relation of the 19th century Arab intellectual to power, politics, and the circuits of knowledge that the press materializes. Al-Shidyak places his newspaper at a distance from any political school while also participating in them. Yet this proxy distance to political concepts and ideologies, I want to argue, is not a mere cherry-picking as a maneuver against censorship or a practice of political opportunism. Rather, this proxy distance is how Al-Shidyak negotiated and practiced modernity. In this paper, I trace Al-Shidyak's deployment of the lexical field of madhab, a word we all know might mean sect, direction, doctrine, school of thought, and destination. We will begin by looking at an article, or several articles in Al-Jawa'id, and then trace our findings back to as-saq al-saq. But first, a definition of madhab. Madhab derives from the root verb dhahaba, meaning to go. Madhab is a verbal form that signifies a name for a place, ism makan, In this case, it signifies the road ahead, or more precisely, the intended destination. It is, quote, generally associated with walking a path, end quote. Madhab is also, quote, often glossed as a rite or school of Sharia law, in the sense of an intellectual or philosophical school, end quote. More conceptually, it is, quote, a fairly loose social organization whose main function is to regulate the legal interpretation of revelation and to determine the authority of a given interpreter to do so. It may also denote a general hermeneutic approach, end quote. Here I argue that madhab is a key word, perhaps a key metaphor, and here importantly not a key concept, that can help us think of the literary forms of the Nahda alongside politics while moving away from the conventions and pitfalls of genre criticism. We can thus think form otherwise. Indeed, the question of genre has been an overarching and determining category of literary scholarship on the Nahda. Important scholarly work has been produced on the conditions of possibility for the emergence of new genres, such as the short story, the novel, and theater. The genealogical study of Arabic generic conventions in the work of Roger Allen, who will be hosting soon, in 2 weeks, 10 days?
29.
On the 29th. So Roger Allen will be here. And the sociological studies of genre by Sabri Hafiz took on the task of finding the origins of genre. Both Hafiz and Allen, however, applied the category of genre too structurally, leading to debates regarding, quote, the first Arabic novel, where an Arabic narrative was expected to have grown into the generic elements of the novel, short story, tragedy, and comedy, those that are already defined by Europe. Translation theory gave rise to a more nuanced picture of uneven interaction through the categories of contact zone, Mary Louise Pratt, and translation zone, Emily Apter, who a week ago presented here as well. This shifts scholarly attention from the origin story of the novel to the formation of subjectivities in the colonial encounter. This project learns from this past scholarship while extending and relating the question of genre as form to the changing epistemologies of the 19th century as content. The concern with the emergence of new genres within a world system has been translated into the interlaced rubrics of modernity, capitalism, and with them the movement from the pre-modern to the modern. This movement is elucidated in Walter Benjamin's The Storyteller. Benjamin describes the movement simultaneously as the departure from the tradition of oral storytelling and the falling value of experience, whereby, quote, every glance at a newspaper demonstrates that it has reached a new low, that our picture, not only of the external world, but of the moral world as well, overnight has undergone changes which were never thought possible. End quote. This fading experience, or the disjuncture between experience and expectation, however, is not, quote, a symptom of decay, but rather only a concomitant symptom of the secular productive forces of history, a concomitant that has quite gradually removed narrative from the realm of living speech, and at the same time is making it possible to see a new beauty in what is vanishing, end quote. Benjamin's study of the changing modes of storytelling gives us a symptom of a global historical conjuncture in which Arabic literature was participating in and not just reacting to. Benjamin helps us trace this change, since, as Frederick Jameson informs us, Benjamin's essay is not meant to inform us about a true definition of the lost storytelling. Rather, it is not an origin story. Rather, we are better served to see in it, quote, an instrument for the diagnosis of various modernisms, of those forms which emerge after the crisis of the older storytelling possibilities, end quote. If Benjamin's diagnosis is helpful in tracing subsequent literary developments, then it points us toward the very texts that tread the incommensurable zones between experience and expectation. To attend to such texts, we are required to offer a method of reading or interpretation and ask, how do we read a text so removed from generic conventions? How do we organize it analytically? And how does our interpretation of it vary for our organizational strategies? It is the interest of this paper to offer a call of return to the primacy of content over generic forms, especially when considering texts that stand on either side of the divide and defy classification under ready generic rubrics. This essay travels in the direction of Paul Ricoeur's negative hermeneutics, which, quote, has its essential function demystification, and is in that at one with the most fundamental modern critiques of ideology and illusory consciousness associated with the names of Nietzsche, Marx, and Freud, end quote. Moreover, the return to content is not a complete forsaking of form, but a path at the end of which form is imminently understood. The ambition, then, of this paper is to trace the usage of madhab as an untranslatable key word that provides us with meta-commentaries on literature, form, and their politics in Al-Shidyak. So, Ahmed Faz Shidyak was born to Maronite parents in the town of Ashkout in Lebanon in the beginning of the 19th century, 1804 or 1805. He would later add Ahmed to his name after his conversion to Islam in 1860. He attended the Ain Warqa school, where other leading figures of the Nahda attended as well, most notably perhaps Boutros al-Bustani. He was schooled in logic, rhetoric, theology, as well as the Arabic and Syriac languages. After his brother was tortured to death because of his conversion to Protestantism, Ahmed traveled to Egypt in 1825 on the invitation of American evangelists. In Egypt, he works as an Arabic teacher for missionaries and occupies a post in the official newspaper, Al-Waqa' al-Masriya, Egyptian Affairs. In 1834, he travels to Malta, where he edits books and teaches the missionaries in Arabic. In 1848, he travels to England to translate the Torah to Arabic. In 1851, he travels to France, where he eventually publishes As-Saq al-Saq in 1854. In 1857, he proceeds to travel to Tunis under the patronage of the Bey of Tunis, only to relocate to Istanbul in 1860, where he edits and publishes his famous Al-Jawa'ib newspaper. He died in 1887 in Istanbul, and he's buried in Lebanon in Al-Hadath and Hazmiye, and they're going to build a Amara over his grave. So that's Al-Shidyak. Al-Shidyak loved the verbalism of language and the paronymic system that verbalism allows. This paronymy appears readily in The Secrets of Morphology and Metathesis, or in Arabic it's called Sir al-Layali fil Qalbi wal Ibdali. This translation of the title is Humphrey Davis's. Al-Shidyak communicates a theory of language in this philological dictionary that positions verbalism and sound as the point origins of language. He says, I saw that most of language is taken from the telling of a sound and the telling of a craft. We read in the book's introduction. Al-Shidyak moves away from theological foundations of language and rarely approaches the religious, placing himself within a tradition in which, quote, some have gone so far as to say that the origins of language is the audible sounds, such as the sound of the wind, the roar of the thunder, the purl of the water, the braying of the donkey, the caw of the crow, the neigh of the horse, and the snort of the antelope. From them language was born, and this is a sound and acceptable doctrine, madhab. End quote. His attentiveness and dedication to this theory of language, to this madhab as he calls it, informs and qualifies his entire work, so that in the author's introduction to As-Saq al-Saq, he writes that one of the two concerns of the book is to make apparent, quote, the oddities of language, of which are substitution, qalbi, and swapping, ibdal, end quote. Jeffrey Sachs places Al-Shidyak within the intellectual milieu of Nasif al-Yasiji and Boutros al-Bustani, whereby, quote, the privileging use of language is what joins them. Sachs explains the upsurge in the writing of dictionaries, encyclopedias, and lexicon to a thrust of Enlightenment philosophy shared by these three authors, whereby language is no longer an end in and of itself, but a means to an end. Sachs offers a reading of al-Bustani's language reform as a symptom of juridical Enlightenment discourse and colonial violence. Yet, extending this argument, by which, quote, synonymy makes language poorer, end quote, to Al-Shidyak, is to give Enlightenment discourse too much force in comparison to the heavy lifting that Al-Shidyaq's work performs. In other words, Al-Shidyaq's Arabic philology is a different practice than the Orientalist philology Sachs locates in Butros al-Bustani. For example, in كشف المخبى عن فنون أوروبا أو حضارة أوروبا تمدن أوروبا, Al-Shidyaq recounts his dismay at English Orientalists' Arabic translation and their ill mastery of the Arabic language. Al-Shidyaq bemoans both the Orientalists' misunderstanding of Arabic grammar and their lack of knowledge of idiomatic Arabic. This leads Al-Shidyaq to be doubtful of the ability of any man to learn any language at any age. Quote, "This is not my belief, madhabi," he says. "I'll give all my books to any foreigner if he is to compose 2 lines of sound Arabic poetry." End quote. Dr. Lee, his interlocutor in this conversation, proceeds to hand him 3 lines of poetry, challenging Al-Shidyaq's there. After Al-Shidyaq corrects Dr. Lee's Arabic mistakes in the poem, Dr. Lee responds by saying, quote, "The language of the Arabs is unlike other languages. It is not written, matbu'a. It is highly constructed, musanna'a, taxed by plenty of grammatical rules and constraints." End quote. In Al-Shidyaq's text, Orientalists' interest in the Arabic language comes not from pure interest in the language, but simply as a tool of comparison. Comparative philology is presented in this text as Dr. Lee's only vehicle of knowledge of Arabic and other Semitic languages. If the Arabic language is only interesting in comparison to other languages, Orientalists like Dr. Lee use it strictly within a comparative philological framework. And within this framework, Arabic is subordinated to Hebrew and Aramaic, and definitely to English, French, and German. This subordination becomes apparent when Dr. Lee tests Al-Shidyaq on the origins of the Alif. Should I wait a bit? Or is it fine? Yeah, I can see it. So, he tests Shidyaq on the Alif in Imru al-Qais's famous poem, Kifa Nabki. Do you know what the Alif is in Imru al-Qais's saying, Kifa Nabki min dhikr habibin wa manzili? Al-Shidyaq responds with the accepted answer. He says, "For some, the Alif is that of the dual, for the poet is talking to 2 of his companions. For others, it is there for emphasis." End quote. These answers do not satisfy Dr. Lee, who, quote, this is how Shidyaq describes him, taught Arabic at Cambridge even though he did not know how to speak it. End quote. Instead, Dr. Lee retorts saying, quote, "This is all confusion. The Alif is taken from the Ha in Hebrew, for the Jews follow the imperative verb with the Ha to signify requesting or pleading." End quote. Dr. Lee's answer alters the Arabic poetic tradition by failing to understand it on its own terms. Dr. Lee's explanation is grounded in an Orientalist philology that Edward Said and others have condemned as an act of colonial violence on the languages of the colonized. Dr. Lee exercises here what Amr Mufti diagnoses as philological Orientalism, a practice of reading that folds existing textual regimes into foreign coordinates, a translation that positions a language on the terms of another. Through Dr. Lee's Orientalist philology, Arabic, quote, enters the world's literary system, one among many other literatures, being subject henceforth to the requirements and measures of literariness, replacing the models and modes of evaluation internal to the textual corpus itself. Furthermore, in the moment of its historicization, it undergoes a shift of orientation within the larger social formation, being reinscribed within the discursive system for the attribution of a literature to a language, understood as the unique possession and mode of expression of a people. Al-Shidyaq is suspicious about Lee's philological practice, casting doubt onto his method and complaining about his biases. In turn, Al-Shidyaq complains about Lee's comparative philology, his mixing of Hebrew words and Hebraic syntax with Arabic, his liberty and mania, hawas, in translating Arabic idioms to English, and his aversion to rhyme. Quote, "He fears the blame of his colleagues, yet there is nothing more idiotic than to translate one language to another from the standpoint of enunciation and syntax. It cannot be imagined that one language matches another in expression. How can we say in Arabic," he's quoting the Torah here, or the Psalms, "smoke rose from his nostrils and fire from his mouth devoured," as they do in Hebrew. End quote. This glossal translation points to a rejection of the use of Orientalist philology as a lens through which to understand the Arabic language and its deployment. The Orientalists of Cambridge and Oxford offer al-Shidyak frustration rather than enlightenment. For al-Shidyak, understanding comes prior to comparison. In this, al-Shidyak teaches us about what it means to be, as we heard a week ago from Emily Apter, against world literature, or the framework of world literature. Accordingly, we read al-Shidyak's aim in Ghunyat al-Talib to, quote, rectify the mistakes of individuals of acumen and understanding, as a response to the scant knowledge of the Arabic language on its own terms. Quote, I have troubled my conscience and occupied my thoughts, al-Shidyak tells us in the introduction, quote, to address the difficulties and ease the demands of the Arabic language. What is aimed at by this work, he continues, is to facilitate the idiom, ibara, as much as possible, especially for those foreign to this tongue, غريباً على هذا اللسان. End quote. Al-Shidyak responds to the incompetency of British Orientalists in Arabic by composing a book to enrich the students of Arabic language with knowledge of its grammar. Uncovering the secret of the Arabic language, he proposes that the process of sculpting, nahat, is adequate to the translation and incorporation of new words and idioms into the Arabic lexicon. We understand al-Shidyak's frustration with Orientalists who attempt to translate without understanding as an incapacity to sculpt a translated text into being. His Arabic philology qualifies his mode of reading and translation, whereby comparison can only aid in the act of translation, and vice versa, only if the latter, translation, is based on a sound philology. Now, what is the material effect of this? Al-Shidyak begins an article called Tamaddun on civilization with an etymology of the word Tamaddun. He says, it is clear that Tamaddun comes from the word Medina, and Medina is in turn derived from Medina, meaning to be of the correct opinion. End quote. Noting how foreign languages similarly trace the origin of the word civilization to the setting of the city, though without giving specific examples, he says, quote, for when they say this person is civilized, it is the same as when we say muta'addib, learned. We may translate it for now. End quote. Yet, this concept is still easily abused, for, quote, each craftsman considers his craft to be the marker of civilization, such that if a photographer were to go to a country and finds no person of his trade, he judges this country to be uncivilized. This is also the case of the singer, the dancer, and others, end quote. And this confusion of the meaning of civilization extends to the diverse everyday practices of different people. Al-Shidyak, quote, marvels at how people are forced to adopt a certain mode of dressing or eating, considered to be civilized, while they sulk at not being able to do what they desire. End quote. The concept of civilization, then, would need more depth and clarity for its correct usage. Especially in, quote, this century that has been decorated with many inventions and scientific innovations, yet we are still close to our primal condition, al-hal al-khulqiyya. I mean the barbarity we witness in those civilized countries, especially all the killings, assassinations, thefts, kidnappings, sedition, and seduction. Al-Shidyak doubts both the applicability of the concept to the English and the French, as well as their usage of it, reaching a logical conundrum. He says, so it is to be said, either these evils and transgressions are a result of civilization, or that these evils are contrary to civilization. If the first opinion holds, then we are not civilized because we are free of these evils. If the second opinion holds, then we are aligned with civilization, despite all the watchmen that stalk us maliciously to rid us of it. In a careful negotiation of the concept of Tamaddun, starting with its shared etymology, Al-Shidyak fights back against accusations of incivility by clarifying the very concept that the Ottoman Empire and its subjects are purported to lack. We find at the end of the article that the discussion of Tamaddun in Al-Jawa'id is spurred by rumor that Algerian Jews are forced to convert to Islam, even though, quote, this is contrary to the religious amenities that the state provides. The concept of civilization, then, is worked out in the article as a conceptual attack against charges of sectarianism. It continues to function similarly in another article called On the Principles of Politics and Other Matters. Between issues 387 and 389, in May 1869, of Al-Jawa'id, the article On the Principles of Politics and Other Matters retains the concept of civilization as a yardstick by which to measure politics, nepotism, language, and sectarianism. Al-Shidyak is quick to disassociate these principles and conditions from the East-West divide. He reads Tamaddun geographically and temporally as related to the divide between the country and the city. In this move, he participates in a common 19th century normative opposition between city and country. The most famous example is Karl Marx describing the countryside of France as a sack, as potatoes in a sack form a sack of potatoes. This is from the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. Instead of writing the word Hadara or Amran to denote civilization, Al-Shidyak, following fellow Nahda intellectual Rifat Tahtawi, writes Tamaddun. Choosing Tamaddun over Amran is a further distancing from Asabiya, or group solidarity, as theorized by Ibn Khaldun. Tamaddun is figured as an ongoing historical process. Quote, the civilization of the kingdoms of the Franks did not prevail in it all at once, but occurred gradually. End quote. This understanding of Tamaddun allows Al-Shidyak to reference contemporary European practices that were already practiced by Muslims centuries ago, saying, quote, the difference of sects, madahib, ought not to be a reason for animosity and discord. The Muslim kings of old used Christians and Jews as they would use others. In this age, we see in Europe numerous public associations, composed of Catholics, Protestants, and Jews, that aid all the people of the public. End quote. Here, civilization is no longer only a spatial signifier of the urban contra the rural, but also a temporal signifier of novelty, whereby, quote, tradition, ada, and civilization often quarrel in the field of time until one overcomes the other, end quote. Temporally and diachronically, Tamaddun emerges as the defeat of tradition by craft. New schools of thought and methods emerge from this temporal quarrel between tradition and the process of civilization. To this end, Al-Shidyak advocates for a multiplicity of schools of thought, sects, and ways of going about modernity that constantly modernize as they break with tradition and seek the new within the permanent process of civilization. Now, this conceptualization of Tamaddun and the deployment of the madhab lexical field points us away from the nation state. The concept of Tamaddun here is not linked to the concept of the nation state. We attend to the word madhab to reveal the very contingency of the idea of the nation. This idea has managed to persist in recent scholarship. Fuma Zaks writes, for example, that new ways of writing, of which journalese and the genre of the historical novel are meant to be the prime example, aim, quote, to discover the tools and methods to portray and narrate the saga of the Syrian nation, and to turn it into reality by embedding it into a broader semantic field of civilization and progress, end quote. Zaks here organically connects the rise of the nation-state to the cultural forms she studied, as if one bleeds from the other to the beating drums of time. By paying attention to accompanying keywords that metaphorically open up meaning, the teleological myth of the nation-state is belied. Al-Shidyak's deployment of madhab as part and parcel of the definition of modernity and civilization forces us to look otherwise on the equally contingent and homologous relation between literary form and politics. If the novel nation relation crumbles, what makes way? And here I will move on to as-saq al-saq. I will present two instances in which the lexical field of madhab is deployed in as-saq al-saq to gloss literary form. I hope that just as the metaphor of madahib functions as a qualification of the concept of tamaddun, so is the case with literary forms, and what better text to exemplify this homology rather than leg over leg. Now, Leg Over Leg is a biographical narration of the life of Al-Shidyak. It's 4 volumes, huge, very arduous to read, but we have to do it. Kamran Rastegar reads Leg Over Leg as the literary site wherein, quote, a divide between a pre-modern intuitive relationship to religious belief is enacted, transferring religious identity to a conscious and even performative social event, one that is relational as well. End quote. This divide is enacted through the conversions of Al-Shidyak from one sect to another. So remember, Al-Shidyak was born an Orthodox Christian, converts to Protestantism, and then converts to Sunni Islam. If Rastegar reads Al-Shidyak's conversion from Orthodox Christianity to Protestantism and then to Sunni Islam as moments of transition from a pre-modern relationship of religious belief to a modern one that considers religious identity as a relational social event and projects that transition to the art of storytelling, then we would like to ask if these conversions between and from one madhab to another are written into the text itself in terms of form. If so, how does this meta-commentary on conversion from one madhab to another relate to both literary form as well as the political social sphere of its deployment? And the opening of the 10th chapter provides one of the book's most apparent instances of this, of madhab as literary form, coming as a definition of style and form. The long passage reads, "Rhymed prose is to the writer as a wooden leg to the walker. I must be careful, therefore, not to rest all my weight on it every time I go for a stroll down the highways of literary expression, طرق التعبير, lest its vagaries, مذاهبه, end up cramming my style or it toss me into a pothole from which I cannot crawl. In rhymed prose, the rhyme often leads the writer from his original paths to a place he would never have wanted to reach had he not been subjected to its constraints." End quote. The narrator expresses the burden associated with the writing of rhymed prose in relation to the trajectory of the book, Al-Faryaq's life. Rhymed prose is figured as a literary madhab that is unforeseeable and uncontrollable. Indeed, as Humphrey Davis translates madahib, the vagaries of rhymed prose pose a threat to the author. The narrator, however, exercises wit in the double entendre of the word madahibihi in the Arabic original. In this case, it signifies both the intended destination and the belonging to a school of adab or thought. The word madhab, then, refers back to the author's own positioning within the spectre of adab, while addressing the contingent and precarious situation in which rhymed prose places its author. The narrator is aware of predecessors in the genre of rhymed prose, just as he is aware of their reliance on rhetorical embellishments. In keeping with the professed uniqueness and novelty of his work, the narrator distances himself from the heritage of rhymed prose, saying, quote, "Here our aim is to weave our story in a way acceptable to every reader. Anyone who likes to listen to language that's entirely rhymed and chimed, with metaphors and metonymies adorned and primed, should go to the maqamat of Al-Hariri or the nawabih of Al-Zamakhshari." End quote. The attack against metaphors, metonymy, and other rhetorical embellishments is now extended against the very heritage of Al-Hariri and Al-Zamakhshari. Leg over leg self-differentiates itself through the possession of inner latent meanings, as well as the weaving of a story for every reader, which is something that Al-Shidyak also writes his articles in Al-Jawa'ib to that goal as well. The narrator creates his own literary madhab, democratized to suit any reader, like Al-Shidyak's article in Al-Jawa'ib. Let me delete the word democratized here. I don't want to use it. Suited for any reader, like Al-Shidyak's article in Al-Jawa'ib. This madhab does not rely on imitating or copying the style of predecessors. Rather, it departs from it and treads its own road on the many madhab of modernity. This new literary trajectory that Al-Shidyak is advocating for in and through his work, however, is not an easy road to tread. In the 11th chapter, في الطريق العريض, the narrator tells the story about a grammarian and his pupils. The grammarian recounts to the pupils the trials and tribulations of leading the life of a grammarian and a rhetorician. The episode concludes with the grammarian explaining that writers are scarce because criticism fails to see the inner refinement of books and just focus on the surface embellishments of rhymed prose. Al-Faryaq overhears the grammarian's speech and takes heed to his advice of, quote, improving his speech by following the rules of grammar. End quote. If the road to literary innovation is long and broad, then this road is being trod by the very text we are reading, As-Saq al-Saq. Al-Shujaq writes a self-conscious text that points towards its literary madhab with every turning episode. And he associates this new trajectory with the weaving of a story accessible to all readers, but also the representation honest to reality, a proto-realism. This proto-realism stems from the narrator's belief that he ought to, quote, follow, mimic, do the same, wander off the path if Al-Faryaq did, and matching to anything sensible he did. For otherwise, I'd be his foe, not the katib, writer of his life story, or the reporter, naql, of his saying, end quote. He calls this shadowing of the character, quote, an injunction, hukm, every writer ought to follow, or else you find the victim moaning and wailing, objecting and complaining, while the author is rhyming and using paranomasia, making parallel constructions and puns, going off on tangents, switching persons, and playing with unlikely topoi, end quote. An embellished writing would undermine the purposes of writing this book. This stalking exposes the author to the contingency of the many madhahib of modernity. Al-Shujaq's multiple deployment of the lexicon of madhab to describe the many forms of literary writing in leg over leg, and his definition of civilization as a process of modernity with many madhahib occurs at a time in which political change is causing a tension between an old regime and a new politics. He realizes the threat posed by sectarian strife as well as the threat posed by Orientalist philology to the Arabic language. While the latter threatens to approach Arabic only relationally to other languages without without taking it on its own terms, the former threatens to spark violence, as exemplified by his brother's torture and murder after conversions at the hand of the Maronite Church, as well as the sectarian clashes of 1841 and the ones anticipating the publication of Leg Over Leg in 1860. Al-Shujaq approaches and skirts this danger through language and the materiality of the signifier, whereby the signifier madhab multiplies across the terrain of the book. If, according to Al-Shujaq, quote, differences of sects ought not to be a reason for enmity and wretchedness, the differences of madhahib, then Leg Over Leg formally performs this multiple madhahib of modernity. In this performance, language and knowledge production are trapped within, quote, the madness of words which no degree of knowledge can ever stop, or indeed, any simplification of language can tame. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ziad, for this stimulating talk about Shujaq that brings together many of his important articles and ideas to Saq al-Saq. Does anyone have any questions? I can start to heat you up. I was just wondering when you were talking about, okay, so you start off by introducing Saq al-Saq as a rather tedious, difficult read that we nevertheless must work on. And then at some point you say that this is a book suited for reading. I don't get how you...
No. So this is
how you start with the paradox.
It is Shujaq himself that says that. It is a book suitable for all readers, okay? To suit all the, let's say, tastes, or we can even use madahib of all readers, right? In the proem or the Fatiha to this book, Al-Shujaq says that, or asks that the reader not skip anything. He says that if you skip anything, you will not understand my book. So you have to read everything. And of course, we know this is the playfulness of Al-Shujaq, because the book is riddled with endless lists of synonyms and which you need a dictionary to follow. So Al-Shujaq here is testing the reader himself, probably testing the critics, as he later mentions them, about how to read this book. And in the extended version of this paper, I read the Fatiha of the book of As-Saq al-Saq, and I extract from it a method of reading that Al-Shujaq is presenting to us through two verses in particular, in which he is in which he's describing how this book came about. I do not remember these two verses by heart, but I can dig them up later on.
Just to pick up from the last point, I haven't read the Sakh for many years now, but if I remember correctly, the Sakh, you have to read it all to get the whole point, but you don't have to read from the beginning to end. I mean, it's more Jahiz style, where you can enter the book from anywhere practically, or am I wrong?
Well,
I mean, is there a narrative that you have to follow with movement and beginning, climax, and end, or it's like the real Arab style of having so many digressions, so many, I mean, in that sense, you can also skip all these sections about language and small things. And with that, these digressions, Jahiz says it's important to entertain the reader. Where does his humor go into that conception of literature? Because he's a master of, again, Jahizian humor.
Yes, so I think Sakh al-Sakh is maybe a bit different in the respect that there is a structure that to its plot, its narrative, which is the life of Al-Faryab, which makes it follow sort of linear progression, even though there are a lot of digressions. There's even a chapter on Tawriya that Al-Siddiaq writes, and it definitely plays into how he's trying to test the readers and test the limits of his new trajectory of writing. And the quote I just read, in which he's vowing that he will follow his subject, Al-Faryaq, in every step, would make you think that these digressions do not exist, but they exist plentifully. And why is that? Also in the extended version of this, maybe I should have presented the extended version of this paper. In the extended version of this paper, I mentioned how, so even though Al-Siddiaq rejects all these and rejects rhyme, prose, and embellishments, the book is very embellished, very, there's lots of metonymies and metaphors, etc. I say that in the Fatiha, which I did not mention here, he is also saying that you have to read my book in a two-level way. In a level that is superficial, which we would say is the life of Faryaq, and for us to know what happened, a sort of semi-autobiographical detailing of the life of Al-Faryaq. But then he says there is a botany level in which he is presenting us with the commentary on the book. Okay? So in the extended version of this paper, I trace how every episode that I deal with has a zahir and a batin. And
you can always give us another talk.
Yes, maybe next week with a microphone. So there's a zahir and a batin that.
Nadia has a question as well.
Yes, ma'am.
Thanks,
There is still the point of the humor. Could you comment on that?
The humor, it's in relation to the zahir and the batin. The humor is like a we can say it's a mediator in which to really grasp the humor, of course, if you don't understand, or if you don't grasp the botany version or level of the text, you miss it. Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Ziad. Maybe just a comment or something to think through. It's very interesting that precisely this moment that you see Shidyak formulating this. You don't call it a concept. What did you call the madhab?
Key metaphor.
A metaphor.
Yeah.
Well, at the same moment, you have interest in Bustani, his other, right, who formulates this concept of the diyana haqiqiyya, of the true religion, as the solution for sectarian strife, right? And with Bustani, it's a completely kind of political theological narrative, within which he grounds his liberalism ultimately, a way to deal with the different sects is through this idea of a universal religion that is the grounds for the nation to come, or for the watan that needs to be instantiated after civil war, right?
Mhm.
So it'd be very interesting to see, I mean, if we want to say that Shidyak has a different trajectory, that it doesn't go down the route of the nation state, or doesn't provide an argument for that, then it would be important to distinguish how madhab doesn't fall into some kind of a liberal reading again. So, I mean, but the interesting thing is that universal religion is the political theology of liberalism at this moment with someone like Boutros Boutros-Ghali. And it'll be interesting to show, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. How do you think madhab departs from this kind of political theological very present discourse as a solution for sectarian strife, which is, of course, we know, peasant revolt transforms into sectarian strife.
Right.
From the crisis of Ottoman state capital. We know the entire historical moment, and that's why universal religion is not surprising as what emerges from the crisis of state capital.
Yeah.
So how would Shidyak kind of come into this with this notion, with this metaphor of madhab? How would you think you could push it towards a non-liberal reading, if this is what you seem to be proposing? I don't know if I get you correctly.
I'm not sure I am proposing it as a non-liberal thing.
Okay.
I'm not sure that Shidyak is non-liberal.
Okay.
Definitely some aspects of him are not. Some aspects of his are. I think also after 1860, Shidyak is very much, as far as I've read him, he's very much defending the efforts of the Ottoman Empire to skirt the dangers of sectarianism and sectarian strife, as we see in his defense of the Ottoman Empire in the article called On Tamaddun. And I would have to think more about how madhab, this sort of metaphorology of madhab in Shidyak plays against the universal religion الديانة الحقيقية لبطرس البستاني. I'd have to think more about that. I don't have a ready answer for that. But thank you.
Any more questions? I have many questions, but I thought I don't want to ask you, since I'm the moderator, I don't want to take up, we could start a dialogue, right?
Yeah, we can.
But I'll wait just to see if just stop me, just go ahead and talk as I look at my notes, because I didn't prepare what I was going to ask you. Again, a comment. When you were reading from Lee and that episode with Lee, what I was doing is looking, in fact, at how he translates. So how does he translate the Bible here? And does he have a point in this argument he uses against me? And what comes out of from the research I made is that, in fact, Shidyak is not being literal enough. He is baffled by the anthropomorphic attributes of God, and he does not want to translate them. So there is more at stake than just Orientalism and language. There is also how do you deal with divine text and how do you translate divine text. And in that sense, I've been thinking that, he plays too much. And sometimes it's, I wonder, does he always, because he's very careful how he speaks about Orientalism as well. He's not like Edward Said. He doesn't think that this is Orientalist discourse and you should just throw it out. He makes these demarcations in the discourse. Yeah? Or what would you, yeah?
Yes, no, I haven't looked at the actual translations of the Bible that he makes. The interest here was to see how he is negotiating the practice, negotiating the view on language of Dr. Lee in the way that Dr. Lee is interested in Arabic from the standpoint of other languages, which is what Said calls Oriental theology. So language is not accepted on its own terms. Again, it's accepted, it's understood within a spectrum of languages, which other philologists at the time would call dead languages. And how Ashdiyaq is trying to attack that, or attack or defend the Arabic language from that kind of attack by saying, by rejecting simple translations, by proposing the process of nahat, as he calls it, to introduce new lexicography or lexical vocabulary to the Arabic language.
How would that then differ from Tahtawi's relationship to the Sassi, for example?
I don't know.
No?
How would it?
No, but then no. No, we cannot do that.
Just about what you were just saying, about taking, you were talking, you jumped on one sentence that I wrote. You were first talking about that the languages started from telling you noises like thunder and cows and donkeys. Then you said that the madhab is a sound that was acceptable. Then you said a sentence which is synonym make language weak. Then you jumped into something. I did not get that. Just that one sentence.
Okay.
You were talking about the simple translations between and how they could, how they would take kind of words and make them and translate them to Arabic or something like that. But the fact that synonym make language weak, that sentence in specific.
Okay. So all the sentences you just recorded are quotations. The first one is a quotation of Shidiyaq, in which he's explaining that he's explaining his sort of origin theory of language, saying that he thinks that all languages originate from the sounds in nature.
Okay.
Right? And then the second one, I think all synonyms make language weak,
Exactly.
is what Jeffrey Sachs describes what Boutros al-Bustani and other Nahdawis do to the Arabic language. So it's not something that I am condoning. It's how Jeffrey Sachs categorizes Boutros al-Bustani, his opinion about synonyms. Synonyms make language weak, which is and to couple Shidiyaq with that is a bit absurd, because Shidiyaq was very affectionate about displaying his knowledge of synonyms from all the dictionaries. Right?
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
So it is Bustani who actually thinks that synonyms
Right.
make language weak.
According to Jeffrey Sachs.
Thank you, Zia.
Thank you for